Hello, good morning, everyone. Maybe not morning where you are, but it is morning here in Malta and Turkey, where I'm meeting with Michael Sullivan today, who is my colleague, linguist, language specialist, fellow of the U.S. Department of State, um, who has just well, he's about to finish. You're about to finish your book, Building Bridges. Can
Yes.
we can we can we relate and can we love and relate in a polarized world, right?
Yes. That is the question. Yes.
And what so yeah, we just met yesterday briefly. We met via our common friend from France, Julian. Yeah, he
Uh,
connected us originally,
uh,
right? That's how we got.
yes.
Yeah,
Julian. Yes.
Julian, and so it's nice. Like over these, we've had these, almost 4 years now of yes, 4 years, isn't it? Since COVID kicked off, it's like 4 years of like completely different projects where everyone's life has been turned upside down, and we ended up meeting different people and having conversations and having this technology now with us. But then also we have AI, large language models, which we just kind of mentioned, and
Mhm.
perhaps this is a good like departure point for us um, to talk about that, and also like the background of what motivated you to for writing the book.
Sure. Um, well, in my country, the United States, we've seen our politics become extremely polarized in a way that I haven't seen, in my lifetime. Maybe others have who are older than me. But in the 1990s, for instance, maybe 40% of the country really did not care who was elected or who was in control of our government, and that has shrunk down to a very small amount. Statistics say that our country is as polarized as it was during our Civil War. So, and that bodes, ill to us as a country, our institutions, and a lot of things that we stand for. So I started out talking about how important moderation was and how important it was to be in the middle and how tough it was, and how easy it is for us to move to extremes. But in the process of writing that, I found that actually what was probably more compelling for me to write was to talk about my own life and to talk about the 8 countries that I've lived in, and more importantly, the people that I've gotten to know throughout my journey, living in those 8 countries, and the relationships that I have with them. Because there's nothing about me that represents many of the people have contributed richly to my life. And I think when we peel back our fears, we start to realize that people who are different than us culturally or have different values than us, they still have a lot to offer us. And that building bridges with people who are different than us is extremely important. And it's a part of building a safer and kinder society. So that's the undergirding of my book.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, well, it resonates a lot with what I've been thinking about as well in recent times. And which countries were they quite radically different culturally, countries?
Absolutely. And in unexpected ways. For instance, when I married, when I met my wife, who's from the Philippines, my assumption was, and I grew up in Southeast Asia, so I grew up in Thailand, very different than America. So I made a gross miscalculation that people from the Philippines, for instance, would be more or less familiar with the culture that I grew up with, or because they're English speaking, that they would adjust easily to American culture. And I discovered that actually Koreans and Chinese are easier to adjust to American culture, or Western culture, I should say, than Filipinos. So very
Mm.
fascinating bit to find out what Pacific Islander culture was like being married to it. And that relationship, of course, has survived in every way. And that's just one example of relationships from different cultures that have really kind of gilded me into in the intercultural space. Korea, Turkey has been fascinating because you have on the outside, you have a very Western veneer, but some very uniquely Turkish things. And then you have a very Eastern collective societal norms that are familiar to me because of growing up in Thailand. So pick one. I was in Singapore, pretty much the bastion of colonialism there. Singapore, a very fascinating bit with a Chinese culture in a British colonial system. Lots of different things that I've experienced over the course of my lifetime. And so I think it was important to write about at a time where, well, like I said, politics are pulling people apart and things are getting more violent throughout the world.
Yes, and so there's two things I'm thinking about is that yeah, I had a girlfriend from the Philippines as well, so I happened to discover that many assumptions that I took for granted it was completely not. It turned out to be cultural when it's so easy to take it personally, right? To start with like this is just and um, and so it seems to be that all of this process of globalization and the fact that we can live and work and meet people around the world and looking at the world and how we all have values, but these values can become weapons um, if we miscommunicate and if we fall into like the verbal, as the Huxley said, verbal booby traps or linguistic tricks, which are the world abounds and it does seem to like point us towards some sort of a necessity of finding the ground human values, like the common denominator for all human beings who can actually live on this planet without um, feeling insecure about their own local values, right? That is the challenge. That is this paradox, which I truly believe is it's not a contradiction. It is a paradox, but we have been used to not accept paradoxes. We want very clear this or that, and obviously when we have so much propaganda from every side with all these networks, with all these algorithmic processes going on and AIs, it completely exacerbates these age old techniques of pitching people against each other, and suddenly we wake up to this reality. Whoa, we like no one had expected that we would be this polarized. Like that, you basically what you're doing is creating so much noise that even the what used to work for anyone, let's say intelligence agency, used to work on a local level in some sort of conflict. Suddenly, there's like the whole world is doing that, plus individual people like going on social media and imitating those techniques for their own gain, being influencers and so on. And what we end up with is this, as Jamie Will said, everyone peeing in the same pool in a way, right? And
Yeah,
we can't communicate, and we get polarized, and we kind of in this mess now, aren't we?
we are. And one of the things I like to compare it to is the industrialization of food, for instance. We've seen the proliferation of obesity and different health problems with the manufacturing of food around the world. And so the industrialization of anything creates with a consumer-based market, and hey, you need to buy this white bread, and you need to, these things
Marketing,
are
maybe.
great for your kids. There's been a number of iterations throughout history of things that have been sold to us that comfort us but are not healthy for us. And I use that as an example. So now we're seeing the informational version of that. Basically, what comforts us, unfortunately, is going to be the extremes. It's going to be things that massage our fears about ourselves. It's the things that will continue to drive us away from the truth, for instance. I mean, the number of conspiracy theories that are are proliferated these days. It's like, what is the truth at this point? What is actually going on in Ukraine? You know, what or Gaza or other parts of the world, it's hard to know anymore because of the enormous amount of information being cut and pasted in a way to help us consume it in a way that we want and continue to click. It's not healthy at all.
Right. Mhm.
So
Yeah, and see, so this is because, and it's difficult to, it's so we are so used to point the finger and blame, but at the same time, it's a very nature of our nervous system that in order to engage, it has to, that's that you gotta press that button, that emotional button, right?
right.
Which then bypasses our critical faculties, and then people race all those, like, information agencies and news and whatnot, everyone, and marketing, which is, it used to be called peacetime propaganda, but in fact, it's difficult to say what is propaganda and what is marketing these days. They kind of merged into one
Yeah,
block.
they've learned a lot from each other. I mean, they've studied each other immensely. I mean, if you look at marketing and the marketing history in the ultimate capitalist country in the world, my own country, you will understand why we all drink milk and smoke cigarettes to this day, and think diamonds are more valuable than gold. So it's all marketing,
Right. It's all creating a perception of reality at the cost of discernment of reality.
That's right.
And yeah, but I think only now we are in a position to actually notice it because it's so stark. The contrast between what actually proves to be real, where we think, okay, I make this choice. Let's see, 3 months from now or 6 months from now, is this choice good? That can verify for us, but there's been so much gaslighting and so much hyper marketing on every side that, yeah, it's difficult to even know for me, like, to what extent people can discern. But you mentioned fear, and I think fear is critical because I've been very interested for a number of years. One thing is the truth and self-deception. That's like as a philosopher, that's my area where I'm really passionate about. And I think that is the core of approaching this chaos, external chaos, in order to get the internal insight. We need to kind of be in touch with to what extent we lie to ourselves, which is very uncomfortable in a way.
Of
Um,
course.
mhm.
Of
But
course.
and so that's one thing. Second thing is the fear you see, because in the title of your book there is can we love and relate, and it seems, well, we cannot love when we are scared, because when we are scared, we downgrade it to this kind of survival mode. We don't allow, we close down, right? We don't
Yep.
open up. We only when we're open and like you said, we have goodwill before we communicate. We can then relate and even generate the sense of, feel like positive feelings towards people. But
Right.
when we're scared, we just feel like, it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So maybe open up about that as well.
Sure. I mean, the one thing that comes to mind, and I tell the story in my book about alcohol rehab. So I set it off on a pace that may shock a lot of people, but I talk about my failures first, human failures. And I think it's really important to address our lives, start at the bottom and then go up. I mean, any book, when you want to read a book, you kind of want to root for the main character. So I talk about the bottom and alcohol rehab. And it's very interesting that what we would consider loving and relating often involves, and I call a lot of this has to do with drinking culture. You know, when you are surrounded by people who embrace a habit that you might have that's extremely unhealthy, you know, and you are quite afraid of thinking outside the alternatives until, you know, it wrecks your career or wrecks your marriage or whatever it is. And it requires courage to turn your life around, right? It requires an immense amount of courage to walk away from certain things. And I talked about, you know, food issues, you know, for people who are trying to suddenly have a healthy diet. All of these decisions to walk towards the middle in some way to re-regulate their lives requires an immense amount of courage. And fears is exactly the opposite. Fears are what keep us on a road of self-destruction, whether it's our own bodies, whether it's our relationships, whatever it is that will drive us really to the edge. And when you see polarized groups, it's like I said, it's like the drinking buddies. It's like I'm only going to hang out with people who assuage those fears. I'm only going to listen to on my phone uh the voices that tell me the things that make me feel better. And what's the opposite of fear? Courage, of course. Um, and having the courage to move in a direction that may be unknown, but you know it's the one that's going to save your life. And in this case, it's not just saving your life, it's saving your community's life. Because when you have the courage to see the truth, whatever that may be, it may be hard. Maybe you've been a part of a religious group for a long time, and suddenly you realize that maybe some of your beliefs can be questioned. And we're afraid of that, right? So, talking to someone who has different religious beliefs, we either look at them as an enemy because they're going to tell us something different or challenge what we believe, or quite possibly, we might actually find ourselves believing even more in our own values and thanking that person for being a part of our life. So we don't actually, fears don't allow us to see the alternative. Fears on, fears are as a zero sum game, right?
Only, yeah.
One side, you know, it's either all or nothing. And we don't realize that actually crossing the bridge to the other side doesn't mean you're going to have to give up your identity or your values. In fact, if you are secure in your own beliefs and values, you're not going to see other people's as a threat.
Yes, absolutely. And on the neurological level, if we look at it in terms of the brain structure, like, you know, when we are threatened, we lose access to our not only a human cognition, but even mammalian, because mammalian is about relationship, right? The
Mm.
mammals relate, not all of them, but yeah, social. We are social mammals, and when we live in a perpetual state of fear, we kind of lose the access to that. So unless we know this is also like cognitive literacy, which we don't get in our schools, we don't get in our curricula, right? And how is one, unless one is interested in this stuff like you and I, how are people supposed to get the tools, you know, to actually unpack the fact that, you know, it's easier to fool people than to explain them they have been fooled, as the saying goes. And yeah, and I think what did I want to say? Um, I forgot now.
Well, I wanted to say something about the education system that
Go
you
ahead.
mentioned. Um, yeah, I've loved listening to a bunch of very thoughtful educators about what education should look like in our societies. And often they talk about his name. I'm suddenly starting to forget what's his name, Sir. He's knighted. Oh man.
Robinson.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Ken Robinson is great.
I
Yeah,
love him. So
amazing.
I absolutely love him. And his one of his most famous TED Talks that's really well known. he talks about how our education system smacks down curiosity. You know, it really it
Creativity. Yeah.
perpetuates this, again, this industrialized idea of cookie cutter idea of what we are meant to be in society. And it takes it it's as if in a lot of Western society we become creative despite the system, you know. Like,
Let me close the window because it's getting loud. But yeah, you're perfect, perfect, right.
yeah, Sir Tony
Yes,
Robbins.
I think are you referring to the talk how schools kill creativity? I mean, he
Yes.
in general, I think we can link it in the
Yeah.
description of the video. Yes, I mean, it's amazing. I got in touch with it. Well, I come across his work. Came across his work when I did my teacher training,
Mm,
and yeah, since then it's like yes, spot on. But it's just he's a big systems changer in education, I think.
right.
But then when I subsequently I went to work in school in London. There was one colleague in one of the like a famous school, and in many ways one of the best schools. And he was the in curricula. Yeah, he was taking care of curriculum design and the regular direction of the syllabus and
Mhm.
curriculum. And I suggested Ken to him, and he said, "Yeah, but like he gives good critique, but he cannot. Uh, he doesn't give solutions, like." Because the solution is to completely replace the system, not change little bits within the system, right? That's the problem, that we are in this. I like this metaphor. I always say it like we are as humanity in this aeroplane in an aircraft, and we need to replace the engine because the current one is running out of steam, and we have to replace it without landing, and
Mhm.
that's the challenge really before us.
Yeah.
But yeah, what you said about what he was saying about his point is that yeah, we all learn differently, and we all have different views, and we all have different values, and the less pressured we are, the less bureaucratized our institute. Well, I guess you need a degree of bureaucracy so things work.
Sure.
But I mean, it's become, especially in education, it's become hyper bureaucratic, right? Like um, and the behaviors are being there's still behavioral psychology as the blueprint for engineering behavior, right? And then
Sure.
we don't know how that then backfires, how people the violence that we see, the polarization that we see, and hostility and so on, when people cannot really express themselves, they don't have access to their own curiosity because they have to spend time ticking boxes and doing, ABC testing, and
Right.
all of that is taking their cognitive space. And how they're supposed to become people, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's, to me, it kills leadership. It kills our future leaders in certain spheres. If you take curiosity away, you take the fundamental right to think outside the box or do things. I mean, it's funny because I was a startup engineer, or sorry, startup founder of a company and failed. That's also in my book. And they patronize this whole world of Steve Jobs. You know, Steve Jobs, of course, story is well known to everyone, that he dropped out of college and started his own company. And then, but I think a lot of people miss the I think they miss some of the story of Steve Jobs, because Steve Jobs was fired from his own company because his company failed to do what everybody really wanted in that society, is make a profit, you know. And so his ingenuity and, his desire to perfect products that were going to be useful for human beings and all that, and driving up the costs of production and different things. um a lot of what was missed from the story is that he got fired because he wasn't making something cheaply and expendable enough for the company to seriously make gains and make a profit. In other words, he was fired um, for being curious, for being, innovative. And So it's funny how they took that and then repackaged it and remarketed it again, just to be another iteration of creativity and thing for everybody, for companies' profit. And I don't know
Yeah,
if it's been when we watch the beasts and the giants of social media today and look at some of the serious effects that it's having on society, and we ask these companies to be responsible at possibly the you know make less profit but be more responsible, and maybe use the same ingenuity and innovation that created those companies to begin with to also make it beneficial and safe, but they're unwilling to because it makes money.
yes, and I think also what's the problem. I've been thinking about this, that if those bosses, if those, because those people are, a lot of those people are pretty young, like they did not study history so well, I guess they did not, they have gone through this education system, in fact,
Yes,
which is
all have.
which is not fit for us, our dealing with what we're dealing with right now. But then, yeah, the point is, I see it as, the more I think about AI, the more I see it as almost as a metaphysical entity, that those people, we tend to think of people as having agency, but we know that majority of our actions are unconscious. And then when you have such powerful tools modifying our behavior without us realizing it,
Yeah.
we know has been evidence, we have evidence for that, then those decision makers at the top of some of those companies, I don't consider their actions being conscious, and their choice of, with, let's say, sacrificing a bit of profit short term to get larger profit long term, because that means you need to cut your income
Right.
right now. That's the step you're talking about
Yes.
in a more extreme form, is like the existential choice of stopping drinking or leaving a job or something, that
Yes.
has to be that courage of like, it's a
Yes.
discrete step. It's not a continuous step. It's a discrete step, but it requires awareness, right? And I
Yes.
think and I think they do not realize that what they're actually doing is they're debasing the audience, or the users, as they call them. They're debasing the users of the services, because the users are becoming more and more brain dead, really, as a result of spending, being incentivized to spend more and more time, and their vitality is decreased because there's more mental
Yes.
health, and there's more, they can be good for now, but their life force is withering, their cognitive capacities are downgrading. It's almost like it's like an invisible eugenics program, right?
Yes.
That's emerged from that process. And
So
all
true.
people wanted, people just applied the old the practices developed under industrialism to a completely new era, to a completely
Yes.
new kind of tools. And no one seems to have noticed that these tools are of completely different kind.
Yeah, in every way, in every way. And I love how you said it because it is subconscious or unconscious. And we have people railing against it. I mean, what's funny if you watch the political discussion in my own country, for instance, the banning of TikTok recently in U.S. Congress, or this forced sale.
I did not see this one now.
Oh, okay. So recently, U.S. Congress is forcing basically TikTok to be sold to an entity that's other than the Chinese government, because the Chinese government has part ownership of the larger holding company for TikTok. And what's fascinating watching this debate is that everybody villainizes the leadership of these companies, or on the other side, people are villainizing the politicians, as if everybody's making these conscious decisions to do the wrong thing, for their own profit. But most of these decisions are all subconscious. They're all survival minded, just reactions. that people make within the context that they're in. They're not consciously trying to be evil, but we're not making a collective effort to abate the problem. Nobody, and that two things, we're not engaged collectively in community to say, hey, we need to do this. And because we've had leaders being educated in the systems that we've had for so many years, we have very few people willing to lead or stand in the way. People who do acknowledge and know and will probably really enjoy my book, are more inclined to retire, collect their benefits rather than continue
Yeah,
to
I think it's
to
just
lead in the onslaught, because it's to stand out there and be a voice is hard.
it's hard. It's hard. I've been thinking because I found myself having to do this thing, 2020. But I think also I'm looking at my background and like because I told you I'm from Poland, so background of what blood flows in me, like
Mm.
oppressed consciousness. It's like my friends from because the Poland, between Russia and Germany, and then we had all the annexations and all the insecurities. So
Mm.
if we did not defy, if had we not defied, we wouldn't have survived. So as a nation, defiance is our survival strategy. In fact,
Mm.
but then like I speak to with friends from Ireland, I always get on with the Irish because they always had the English, so it's similar. It's like
Yes,
the
yes.
fight is your adaptable strategy. Like that's what you're adaptive for. But then also see the benefit of living abroad. And I'm lucky to have lived in England for 15 years and last six in, exposed to really good education and colleagues, and many interesting discussions and people from around the world. In fact, when I did my, and now I teach kids from all around the world. So I get to actually um, teach them curiosity, in fact, and we have conversations where everyone is really sharing what they want to share,
Mm.
frankly and respectfully at the same time. So this
Interesting.
balance, right? And when I have good insight into this because it's almost like a research exercise for me because it's one of the largest schools of the largest company in the language company in the world. So we
Mm.
get in the season we get maybe 1,400 kids
Mm.
in the school, and I get boom, boom, boom. They go, come and go, come and go. So you gotta build rapport very quick. You gotta get them talk very quick, and you meet many from Asia.
Nice.
And it's mostly, let's face it, it's not as diverse. It's mostly white kids from Europe and the Western non-English speaking world. But then, yeah, we also get Asians. We also get occasionally we get someone from Libya and so on. From different geopolitically different places. But I also find that your point in your book is like ultimately we all not so different. We all care about the same things.
Yeah.
We just have different names, which we inherited from our communities, from our cultures, from our mythologies, and so on. So we like to assign, we are attached to those things, and we have a history and memory of people warring for those ideas, one being prevalent over the other.
Mm.
But I mean, we simply cannot afford to think in that way if we want to survive as a whole, as a
Right.
species. And that's the challenge now, isn't it? That's the evolutionary shift that is the critical thing we have to achieve somehow. And I'm sure, well, we have nothing to lose, first of all. So we may be idealistic like this. I think we must have a go and try to transcend the local differences um, for more planetary consciousness. And I don't mean globalism, by the way, by this. I think that a lot of the ideology around the globalist movement also is not always helpful. So I think that
Right.
this local sovereignty is as important as a planetary interconnectedness,
Yeah.
right?
You will not hear me use the word. You hear me specifically avoid using the word global or globalism because of that too. I mean, it has something to do with my identity, how I grew up as well. But yeah, I see sovereignty as and different pieces, moving pieces being beneficial, not fighting against a common goal. So
And that's
just,
but also that's
just as
also very sorry.
no, I mean, just as you and I are different
Totally.
sovereignties and systems can be different and still work together as well. It's not, we do not need to be a one world anything. So
Right, and it's such an American idea as well, isn't it? Individual sovereignty and
to
self.
our, yeah, to our discredit in some regards, everybody got to see America handle COVID-19, and that was embarrassing from the outside looking in, of course. But what I would try to do is try and explain to people what was going on at a lower level and why it was so difficult because of the enormous amount of freedom of different states. It is a United States of America, but not as united as people think.
Yeah, and
Because
like I said,
most people's picture of the United States is from our federal government, our collective engagement, with the Department of State or Department of Defense, of which I've been part of both now in my career. So that's what people see of America as this collective, thing. But Americans inside, no, they're from Kentucky, they're from Illinois, they're from, New York City. These are their worlds, and they're not connected as much as people like to think they are, and that is part of the problem, but part of our strength in some regards. There's two wheels turning at the same time. So
yeah, so definitely, I think it's we got this what now we got this huge distrust in authority, right? That's the main problem because
that's American. that's that's very American.
well, the distrusting the authority, distrusting.
100%. I mean, no, um, in my book, I talk about conspiracy theory and talk about the reason why conspiracy theory is so prevalent in a place like the United States. Some of it is for good reasons, autonomy, freedom of thought. Living in a liberal society, you're going to have snake oil salesmen, you're going to have different things, with freedom that may cost something. And that's why you need institutions to hold those forces back. But also Americans, whether you are a Black American whose ancestry is unknown because your people were treated like barn animals for 200 years in American history, so you've had your legacy completely scraped away, so of course you don't trust the government that has been responsible for the demise of your own people for over 200 years. You're not going to generational trust of the US government among Black people is just, extremely low, which is why they refused the COVID-19 vaccine. It had nothing to do with education, it had a lot to do with the trust of institutions. And then go to the other extreme, then you get a large portion of America that's still angry about the Civil War, 4 or 5 generations later, that doesn't trust the government that destroyed their autonomy. Then you have the religious element of America that doesn't trust the government because it's liberal and it allows other religions. So there are so many cooking, I mean, we're called a melting pot for a reason in the United States. So we have a lot of things going on that create the reasons to believe a certain angle, of I mean, you ask 1/3 of Americans, they're not sure if we went to the moon. So our own people are not necessarily convinced that we achieved, one of the greatest, technological achievements of the world, and it's fascinating,
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. So and yeah, the also conspiracy theory as a term itself can be harmful because sometimes it's also convenient to use it likewise to
Yeah.
obfuscate something that is actually in the interest of
Yes.
the public, but then it can use equally be weaponized to spread
Yes.
disinformation,
And
right?
that's
And who is the authority to be an arbiter of that? It's a discussion, right?
and it used to be, and I sorry, but it used to be, when our elected officials, especially running for president, it was always okay, my party won, but we need to bring all Americans together. That is not that is not the message anymore of politicians in America. It used to be kind of a game, it was like, throwing dirt at the other politician. But at the end of the day, we're all Americans, good and bad. But nowadays, it's really getting to the point where the message is to a base, and the rhetoric is dangerous. It's
Mm.
it's it's starting to get the crazies out on both sides. And that starts to create some of the things, like you said. Do we read history? Do we see that we are still human beings at the end of the day, and we operate very much like other human beings, and we will make mistakes if we don't have the courage to overcome, our fears. And I see some very, very unhealthy, some very dangerous trends going on in my own country politically. And I mean, you're from Poland. I think I follow a little bit of European politics. You guys are pretty familiar with similar things as well. So
Yeah, it's and just moving away from America itself, from the US itself, but maybe the West. If we look at the West
mhm.
and the consciousness and overall um, threat of, because we agreed there's this crisis of authority, and I myself am very anti-authoritarian by default.
Mhm.
So because yeah, I think the way I was brought up, the way yeah, my own particular situation was that I had to learn to think for myself, and that's why I'm kind of also courageous, but the danger of it is to sometimes overdo it, and I noticed that as well. um, because the fact is, we like you said, we need sovereign states. That is at the moment is kind of critical, and it's been slipping, right? Um,
Sure.
we we want sovereign states, people being able to take decisions according to their own standards and their own national values and whatnot, without devolving into a totalitarian nationalism, as we
Right.
had to. Like this is the lesson we want, because we don't want, and having a. It also seems like
Yes.
we need some level of planetary governance,
Yes.
right? Because there are issues like planetary boundaries being transgressed and so on, where and the climate and
Yes.
all the issues that concern all of us all together as a species.
Yeah.
So to safeguard both of these polarities, where we have that national sovereignty and we have some sort of governance, while not outsourcing while not, I mean, while safeguarding the planetary governance against becoming a global tyranny, right? That is the real challenge right now, isn't it?
It is. It's always the challenge. And I mean, when I set out to write my first book, I was saying that challenge keeps us alive. Like,
Mhm.
friction is what keeps us moving.
Yeah.
Possibly us being able to have to make an effort to get out of bed, uh,
Yeah.
it allows our muscles to grow or be maintained. Friction and the challenge of life in general is what keeps us alive. And when we continue to look for ways to make that easier, oftentimes it's not it's not to, so conflict does not have to be violent. Conflict is healthy. I don't agree with you. You don't agree with me. Let me see why you believe what you believe, and maybe you'll have the patience to do the same. And when that happens, suddenly some crazy thing happens. It's called respect. We respect each other.
Mhm.
We don't necessarily look like each other. We don't necessarily have the same beliefs, but there's a certain element of respect. And you talked about sovereignty and borders. They're all about that. Institutions being built is about setting boundaries because as people, we need them ourselves. We have walls, I mean, we create walls around ourselves so we don't stare at our neighbors when we sleep. We 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 set boundaries for ourselves. All boundaries are not necessarily to be challenged. And so I can understand the current fears that happen in Europe, in America, in Asia, and different places when you have a large number of migrants or people fleeing areas of conflict to go live somewhere else. But I can also understand the fears associated with that as well, and so having to fix those problems requires an immense amount of leadership and understanding. You talked about climate. I was going to mention it earlier as well. For us to solve larger planetary issues, there are a huge number of gaps to be bridged.
Mm.
The largest is economic, telling people in the developing world that they need to make sacrifices on behalf of the planet when they haven't reached the level of living standard that we have in the rich world is grossly uh demeaning. It's they want what all people want, and that's opportunity and safety and education and various things for their families. And often we come across globally, as saying, well, you got to stop burning wood to keep yourself
Yeah, but
at
I
night.
won't, but
You know what I
but
mean?
I don't want to freeze at night. So your
So
policy
it,
is not compatible with my conditions. Yeah.
right, but we're not necessarily willing to give up our wealth that we
At the
have
same time. Hmm.
to create alternatives for them as well. And I'm scarily getting into this. Well, are you saying that we should be giving? I'm not necessarily saying anybody should do anything. I'm just that gap, that chasm is very huge. And it's funny because we start off, we're both language specialists. We work in the language field. When I engage, I'll be getting into a PhD program in the near future. And what I want to show the world is that language is not the only barrier that needs to be crossed. I want to show that language even shows us different economic or geographic or cultural realities that actually create the languages that we have. And so that can be studied intricately, and you can see how those things shape us and create the world that we have, the diversity that we have. Is that something that is a challenge, merely a challenge, not good or bad, just something.
No, exactly. I like the way you pointed to this, that conflict in itself is not bad.
No,
Yeah, we have been made to believe that you should be in harmony with every single person. And then that
yeah,
obviously creates a perfect environment for one person not being friendly
right,
to completely smash the whole system, right?
right.
It's
I mean,
like back to the talk about distrust in the governments. Like you may have 98% of the government doing the right job, and there's 2% of bad actors or wrong decisions, and it completely dis- destroys the reputation because there's the leverage, basically down the line is big. It creates all these catastrophes, right?
yeah, I think you just described the US government almost, of every term. I mean,
Okay.
our government works despite the people at the top mostly. I mean, it's kind of ironic because people often ask, how are you guys the greatest country on earth with some of the goofballs that you guys elect at the top. And I said, well, I mean, there's a lot of great people that run, there's some very, very competent people in the American, federal system that do their job every day, are thoughtful and continue the wheels turning. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like, but I think I'm not being specific. I didn't mean that in the context of the US, but
Oh
in general,
no,
I think it's
I'm an
like,
American, so.
sure. So, but I'm, because I've been observing being in different places throughout this since 2020,
Mhm.
and reading on it and trying to make sense of, the fairest perspective on
Mhm.
giving people credit, because we have to work with people increasingly who actually, we, like you said, completely different values, and there's this inertia within the system, like you said, that people just, they never got the tools to, like, not everyone is equipped for standing up
Yeah.
and saying what has to be said. And we are so disincentivized,
Yes.
through policy and through, maybe not it's because the capital has kind of colonized governance in a way, right? If we
Yeah.
can, like that, is that the corporate world has grown so strong with big tech and with other industries too, that it becomes very difficult with also wielding the communication technologies in a way that it's easy to justify for oneself doing something when it's also very easy to do that. Uh,
Hmm.
Whereas standing up for what otherwise might have been a good idea becomes hugely costly, socially, economically,
Yes.
and so on. And because it's so disincentivized, it furthers this inertia, where
Yes.
we lose leadership skills and we lose conscientiousness, and we lose some sort of like the basic sense of values and dialogue as a
Yeah.
part of. Yeah, I don't know. I also had another point, but yeah, that's no. I think I was going to say that it's critically like important for me to highlight that in every institution, every company, every community, all the way from the top to the very down in your local community, there's always, usually, most of people of goodwill, but sometimes it takes that rotten apple somewhere, who
Yeah.
happens to be in a position to kind of redirect the entire system, or redirect people's actions towards somewhere,
Yeah.
and then it creates a perception to it undermines trust in the whole, and we pull this baby with the bathwater, right, in terms of the
Yeah.
public. But it's important, like, those people are people like you. They have
Yeah.
families. They have the stories. They try to keep their jobs. They try to pay their mortgages, and struggling with this kind of predicament. It's a real difficulty, right? It must be.
It is. Couple things come to mind. Simon Sinek, why do good leaders eat last? I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember exactly what he wrote about. He's talking about corporate leadership. Of course, does a lot of talks. And then, of course, Kemal Ataturk, the founding father of Turkey, modern Turkey.
Mhm.
Um, when good leadership requires self-sacrifice in many ways, and there isn't a lot of incentives these days for leaders to move in a direction that is self-sacrifice in the short term to perpetuate these legacies of that you know bring prosperity and goodness to communities all over the world. Leadership requires the moral integrity of knowing that what you're doing is for the benefit of others, and that's does that exist? We try to out systematize not out systematize we try to systematize everything, and we try to boil everything down to a policy. It's Western, fascinating discovery, and I think I mentioned this in my book. Fascinating discovery about the East and the West, for instance. In the East, it's all about relationships,
Mm.
and if you get an apartment, your contract in Korea is about 1 page long. And what really matters is the person you're renting from and your relationship with them, and how that is determined, your rent amount, your goodness towards them, and it's just this kind of mutual thing. In the West, you sign this enormous contract with a long list of things you will or won't do in your apartment, somehow guaranteeing the safety between two parties that are unknown. But something that I think Westerners can really learn from the East is that being unknown is dangerous. Not having a relationship at all, not having some solidarity with the and connection, knowing that these parts are not just machine parts, that these are human things that are going on. Your renter landlord agreement, they're not simply just for you to perpetuate your individualistic life, that we are interconnected. And I think in the East has a lot to present. Now, the East has other issues, like if they all heading off, over a cliff at the same time, they will do it. So there are some problems when it comes to, like you said, authoritarian regimes hijacking and killing millions of people in the East. But we do it, we do it in the West too.
But in our own way.
Yeah, in our own way. So there's two different ways that authoritarianism hijacks, life, and I often mention that it requires brevity and kindness and care. Actually, it requires a desire to love and relate to people, that creates responsibility. For instance, you have kids, you have a wife, you love them, you want to relate with them, you will make sacrifices on their behalf. And that is the most basic level of community of all, of course, is family. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I don't know. I was thinking about something. I couldn't sleep that well last night, so I'm
That's all right.
a bit upset, At times I get these calls, but um, I don't know. Maybe carry on with the.
Um,
Yeah,
well,
yeah. Like, sorry, I know what. So it reminded me of the work Nora Bateson's doing with warm data.
mhm,
Also, and language, because again, a lot of the language we use is very like the contract. The contract is very well defined. Like there's all these potential gaps of threats, and are then covered. And then you kind of sign it, and you're not quite sure what you signed. And often there are quite unhealthy agreements there, which you're not aware of. You're signing as well, like double binds and stuff like that.
mm,
Whereas when the relationship is sound, simply when you care about this ground level relatedness between two human
yeah,
beings or between two communities, and I believe like you cannot automate society, even though there are some ideas like that, and there have been investments into that, right?
yes,
I'm just like, oh dear, like those important people really think it's possible,
yes,
And then going back to Nora Bateson's idea of warm data, so I did
mm,
this training last year
mm,
with them, and yeah, I'm gonna go and visit again this year and catch up. It's like a communication biotechnology where people um, addressing the problem which you're addressing in your book. Is basically
mm,
people meeting. There's a host, which like I happen to be trained as a host, and so you tell a story, which is relevant for the topic, that for the question you will ask, and you ask the
mm,
question and say what is, fill the gap in a changing world. And
mm,
then people sit at different stations. They have different stations, just couple of chairs, 3, 4 chairs around
mm,
the room, and every room has every island of chairs has different context. So there's one question, what is something in the changing world? And you have the lot of little islands of discussion groups, basically micro discussion groups. And you have education, you have economy, politics, philosophy, art. And what it does, it fosters trans-contextual learning. So you have these people from different contexts themselves. They visit, let's say they go to London, or they go to Singapore, they go to, New York, and to do the training. We go, like the team go to companies and stuff like that. And people discuss and move between the contexts. So suddenly you get this, like, you're always exposed in this echo chamber most of the time. And suddenly you enter a space where you are challenged to discuss a particular issue, which you might have a strong opinion on, and listen to different people from different contexts across different contexts. And it has the potential, at least for a lot of people, and I know it has that, really open up the mind, and it becomes very uncomfortable because suddenly these evolutionary blind spots which we have, these cognitive biases, they're really challenged. And that's where the conflict becomes healthy, because there's a safe space. There's a space of people in dialogue trying to committing to opening up to different possibilities, different perspectives, and experiencing that conflict when you really want to defend your point of view, but you end up listening. Many of us were sat there thinking, you actually end up listening, and it fosters curiosity, because people share their own stories, and it's through the stories that we actually relate, and stories we relate, because then we become human. It rehumanizes us from this polarized kind of default state. And what it also does is it helps us engage with complexity of human life, because we are complex systems, living systems, and our world through these information networks became like a macro scale complex system, because now we have become connected. Back in the day we were localized cultures, and now we are globalized. So it's like a micro scale exercise for what we need to do as a whole, right? And I thought that's a beautiful technology. But it took me a few months to actually realize the significance of it, and I agree with you that this challenge, the crisis that we are going through, some people call it meta crisis, poly crisis, whatever you call it, like it's the compounding kind of exponentiating compounding current of crises. But they challenge us, like the German poet Hölderlin said, where the danger grows, there also grows the saving power.
Yes.
So it motivates us. It puts us in these situations where we have these conversations, and it makes you write a book, and it makes me do my thing. And it's like, it also makes the people of influence to be more willing to reach people maybe with potential influence, but it really obliterates many of dissolves, I would rather say. Many of these old distinctions, they are not really relevant. Now what is relevant suddenly for us, what emerges, is that all hands on board, and we need to work out the way, and we have all the tools. We are so adaptable, with the most adaptable species, right? So I don't know. No, I'd say we are super adaptable. That is our superpower, rather than we are most adaptable. But this is how we got where we got so far, right? So there's a lot of good stuff to harness, and a lot of good developments in the West that, like sovereignty, like individual expression, like the freedom, and also dealing and doing business with people outside of your cultural. This is arguably our legacy, that we developed this model for relating with people from other tribes, because we have the market kind of mitigating. But then at the same time, it seems that the profit, let's say, has all the in this case, profit or greed or kind of power hungriness, overrode the initial idea that was actually to have a fair society, right?
Yeah.
And it undermined our capacity to relate, which we now can retrieve from the East, but without perhaps losing the reconcile those two worlds will possibly take a couple of 100 years or something like that. But I think it's
Yeah.
possible.
I mean, one of the things that I guess one of the concepts underlying that I've found that has come up in the process of writing my book was, for instance, we may verbalize it as attributing Eastern ideas to the West or Westerners learning from the East. But going back to something that you said earlier about how we actually just start to find out how similar we are. So the concept of relationship is not completely foreign to people in an individualistic society. Obviously not. I mean, we in a country like the United States or any other Western European country, they have enormous resources and efficiency because of people's willingness to work together, right? To form bonds. And I know we talked about Julian and his efforts to humanize the workplace and bring this idea that the efficiency is what has overtaken us in a sense, in a destructive way, and we've lost the relationship aspects of it, and we need to go back and basically pull back, like you said, and it can have a different name. It doesn't necessarily say I'm bringing Oriental ideas to the
Totally. No, I think this really
yeah.
resonates with sorry, go
No, it's
ahead.
okay. It's just
Yeah,
we don't have to repackage it. I'll repackage it in any way somebody's going to consume it. I mean, if they're suspicious of Asian ideas, then I'll just call it something different. But but possibly people might benefit by knowing, its origins or knowing that they can relate to people from the opposite side of the world.
totally. And I think if people learned most ancient history and stuff that we have not learned at school for many
Yeah.
reasons, obviously political reasons, that the victors write
Yeah.
history and so on, right? So there's a lot of information available now which really clarify that we're not so different, and a lot of our origins and our you know theologies and the spiritual blueprints, they
Yes.
initially emerged from the East, and then we
All
kind
of
of
them.
we repackaged
Yeah.
them as well. And so
Yep.
obviously that can still trigger people. Me saying this, like, am I being polarizing now? Am I just speaking the truth? Right? That's where is the
Sure.
boundary?
Right.
But I was gonna say, um, yeah, it's really not about repackaging anything, but simply try to learn with open mind, right?
I
And
think so.
take the best of um, every model that we can have, and to understand that not any model of ethics or trade or politics and so on is perfect. And I think it's just this narcissism of, like, we are the best of whatever people,
Yeah.
we are the best people of any kind, is quite unhealthy in this climate where we need to get on and build bridges.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the thing that comes to mind is something that, of course, I was oblivious to growing up in the spheres that I did, kind of the bubbles that I grew up in, was this Eastern threat to Americans, for instance, and you'll see this play out politically even now, even with the TikTok issue, as I mentioned before. You you see a lot of suspicion, and obviously when we draw up when we see something as a threat, we'll always grab the furthest thing from that group, right? The most remote idea or most ridiculous looking or sounding idea from them and say, look, you see this? Do you want this to be a part of our life?
Mm.
And there was this time in like the 80s and 90s where Americans, there was like this Eastern Oriental infusion because of technology, because of the Japanese economy going crazy, and just a lot of things going on. And suddenly the East started to reach, the United States culturally on so many levels, whether it was Nintendo or anime or, whatever. Um, and institutions, especially religious institutions, were like, no way, I mean, this is not Christian. This is not,
Mm,
and you don't want people suddenly, believing in these particular things and having crystals. And
mm.
there was just a lot of just crazy stuff being pumped into Americans, suggesting that Asians were still a threat after all these years, after World War II, after a post World War II era, that have still infecting Americans' minds today. When
Yeah.
quite the opposite needs to take place, is that actually, to save America, we need ideas from the East or from the South. I mean, it
Yeah.
might be a controversial thing to say right now at this time and juncture, but Hispanics from the South and in poorer parts of South and Central America have brought tremendous amount of cultural diversity and great things to our shores in the United States. But because of our border crisis going on right now, they're seen as a threat. Whereas the reality is just people aren't seeing conflict as a good thing. They're not seeing a collective way to solve a difficult problem. Um, and that's a sad bit, that's a sad part. We are relegated to then, of course, pointing at the extremes and saying, look, do you want this in your country? Do you want that?
Yeah,
Rather
and
seeing people as just like us, just like us.
that will get the most attention again. So people, that will be the stickiest thing to show on
Yeah,
social media. But
totally.
to be the devil's advocate, I must say, well, that's also the same problem. Like we talked about institutions. Then
Yeah.
you have the refugee crisis. I mean, refugees. We have refugees because of the way we have been exporting violence, I guess, right? The West, and now we're gonna take the payment for that. We're gonna have to pay the back. But also, um, the thing is, so yeah, even if you have, let's say, 9 out of 10 of those people being harmless refugees seeking refuge, there's no vetting, and you can't really verify whether there are any people who may cause trouble later, right? And in a state, so that we gotta kind of admit that merit of that argument too.
Well, let's go back to the thoughts that we've had already about collectively handling planetary issues, migration. I mean, it's not just conflict or Western caused conflict that create migration. I mean, we have, we've got tsunamis, we've got even just
Mm,
natural things that create disparate, the disparity. We have people are constantly on the move. They have been for all of humanity. They've been either nomadic, literally, like they literally move around. I mean, civilization's kind of been where people suddenly settle in an area, but we can't change things that are going to suddenly make a place unlivable, for instance. So, add all the other geopolitical power brokerages and other issues, and then you have, exacerbated migration crises and stuff. And that requires, again, it requires leadership that is thoughtful, wise, self-sacrificing, knowing what is best, to create a scenario that is best for most people. And that is a very, very tough task at this point. I am not an open borders guy, to say the least. I'm as concerned as any American about our border crisis in the United States. I know Europe has been dealing with this issue for years. I've seen it with my own eyes, having traveled through Europe. And yeah, it requires an immense amount of collective energy, but where is our energy going? As a prosperous countries, our energy seems to be going towards entertaining ourselves. It seems to be going towards creating more wealth, for instance, that we actually don't need, and so yeah, we just often aren't really we're we're not operating in collective and ways, timely ways. In the case of the United States, timely. If you look at specific political events that have happened in the United States, for instance, part of my government collectively said, "Hey, we are going to protect our borders. We're going to change some laws that are being taken advantage of if a person comes into the country and they raise their hands and say, it's too dangerous for me to go back to my own country, blah, blah, blah. We are forced to then keep them. So we need policy and law changes very quickly in the United States. They're not doing that, collectively changing things so now, because of the political infighting in the United States, we have a humanitarian crisis. So now people crossing our borders aren't being clothed or housed or fed properly because they're now stuck in our country. um, and that's the failure of our institutions to say, hey, do we believe in human rights? Yes. Well, then human rights may be protecting our borders and making some very difficult decisions.
Mm.
We often fail to rise to the occasion and say, these are the resources we have and we have available, um, and that's it. Like I said, boundaries are important, right?
Right, and there's no blueprint or template for
Oh,
where that boundary should be, because everything's changing continuously,
right.
and you take responsibility as, I mean, it's easy for me to say, because let's say anyone in a roughly in a ground area, it's easy to criticize, but when you actually get that responsibility, and then you have to decide, will you decide, right?
Yeah,
Will you take the,
yeah.
the kickback
I
from
mean,
your decisions? And so, yeah, I think,
those are very hard decisions to make because, yeah, there are going to be people, you can't help everyone. We all know that.
yeah, I,
And that's hard. That's hard, and that requires enormous, like I said, resources and thought that I feel are often just misplaced. We have all the technology and enormous potential. Like you said, we are the most creative and flexible beings on this planet. We have the potential to do the right things. I may not know what those decisions or those ideas may be now, but collectively we can solve these problems. We just don't.
yes, and I think just the very fact that, Daniel Schmachtenberger said that, no, it's E.O. Wilson, sociobiologist, said we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And that's our fundamental problem. There's an asymmetrical
Oh,
relationship between
nice.
these three. So
Yes.
no matter how much goodwill we have, we can still be hacked by those technologies. And I would argue, we have been, even through industrial technologies, they made us, we had to conform with how industrial tools worked in order for being
Yeah.
effective with these tools, right? And now, these tools are even more, they influence our consciousness. They
Yeah.
condition us to be in a certain way, but not merely manually, or even psychologically, but cognitively. The very deep code of our identity is being shaped through those networks, through those algorithmic
Yeah.
processes, which they are not conscious themselves, but they suck consciousness out of us, manipulate it, and then spit it out, like in a form, in the most possible sticky way, like ice cream. So eat that. We haven't evolved to eat ice cream, but it gives us more and more ice cream, and we just get like more and more kind of sick on yeah, like you said, entertainment and pleasure, and then there's like it's just more and more efficiency and more meetings and more whatever.
Yeah, it's
But
like ice cream.
we don't evolve our own humanity in the middle of it. We actually get downgraded as humans because
Yes.
it's just more and more of the, I call it from the the part the area of philosophy I'm into is this instrumentarian reason or instrumental reason.
Hmm.
So everything is like a means to ends, means to ends. But it really takes that moment of, like you said, everyone to some extent has to consciously decide to make a little sacrifice here and there in order for the whole system to be like for this project to
Right.
be even viable, right? But we are so addicted from not doing it, for doing the exactly opposite.
Right.
Then it's just how do we, yeah, reverse, not reverse, but how do we kind of hold that inertia that drives us towards our own self-extinction?
Yeah, one of and this is something I'm familiar with
By
from
the
an
way, because I have an appointment in 10 minutes, so we have to wrap up.
oh,
But
okay.
I let you finish off your thought.
Oh yeah, no problem. One of the and this is kind of the thing, a little bit of my soapbox on technology, and I do address it briefly in my book. I would like to address it in a complete book. If you can imagine, my book now is just my memoir. It's just my story, but I think these individual chapters are all leading to a more investigative journey into other books. And the thing about technology, and since I've been in the technology sector as a technician in the US military, and then of course um, as a startup founder, and among other things, just being a person in this world, just watching the vast technological change that we've outsourced giving. And I know this more than anything coming from a nonprofit and religious sector, where because of the efficiency that we have, you'll get the marketing, give $10 a month, $15 a month to, the whatever UN organization, or pick your organization of your choice. We've basically created efficiency that just allows us to not even think about the money. Our efficiency has become, just outsourced to something else. And this is a bit of a, this goes with that saying that you said. I really like that quote about technology, about godlike technology, but it's no longer addressing our human needs or our human quantity to do something. So as we're moving into our entertainment filled self-fulfillment, top of Maslow's hierarchy of need element, um, obsessions,
And then, yeah,
we're like, yeah, here's $30 a month to some poor
right.
sector of the universe. And what's funny is, the reality is that at our core, what we all really enjoy is hearing the stories of people who have circumvented that and suddenly went into that part of the world and said, hey, I actually care to do
Right.
something about it.
Do
And
hands-on
yeah.
help. Yes.
And we're like, wow, that's great. Yeah. And it suddenly wakes us up for a moment, maybe it's a movie that we've seen or a documentary, you know, um, and then we just go back to whatever else we were doing. Um, and I'm not saying that it's these systems are bad, but in my book, I talk about, we either have atomic weapons or we have atomic power,
Right.
and I think the nuclear thing is suddenly front and center now that we have like nuclear facilities under threat in Ukraine, and this sudden threat of nuclear war. The next generation's like, what is that? I have no idea, because they've never seen it. But um, we have a great amount of potential and good to use the technology and the resources that we have, the economics that we have, the efficiency that we have to do great things. Um, but it's never an absence of excellent leadership and human qualities that require caring, loving, and relating. We Technology is not going to save us
Thank you very
alone.
much. Yes,
Not
that exact. Yes, yes. That it's just they are just tools. I think that's a good note
just
to
tools.
finish off. I'd love to do another one. Yeah, you have to run because simply
No, no worries.
commitment. But thanks so much. I think this last statement was exactly what I've been dwelling on too. It's
Yeah.
we really have to grow up to our responsibility with the
Right.
powerful with the tools as powerful as we have these days. And that same goes back to given that we're both language professionals, language models and AIs. And as much as you said, we outsource that relationship of giving and that interaction with the actual face that we're giving to and having that
Yeah.
exchange. It's also more and more, it's easier and easier to outsource our cognitive skills through using these language modules for more than necessary, right? Because it's easy. But
Yeah.
then when we read it, we still don't like it. We like when it's written with maybe even if there's a mistake, like, wow, a
Mistakes.
human wrote it. Real
We're
human wrote
starting to
it.
like
Excellent.
mistakes.
Yeah.
Yes. Interesting. I
Mistakes
noticed
are
that
the
too.
new gold. So yeah, thank you, Michael. Brilliant. We'll meet again. I recommend everyone pledges for Mike's book. The link will be in the description, and see you soon. Thank
Now
you
the
very much.
relationship is what I'm most thankful for, Adam. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes, I'm so glad we connected. In this context, so we can follow up and see how the sale goes and everything.
Yes. Thank you. Take
Thanks very
care.
much. Cheers.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.